My name is Elise Morse-Gagne, and you wanted to know how long I'd been teaching here? I moved here in the fall of 2005, in August, just before Katrina.
Okay, and can you give me a little background about yourself?
I got my degree from, let's see, you were asking about that. I got my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
I know I can remember this really, a while ago, about 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. So late, relatively late. I started early and I finished late. It took a long time. Okay.
Okay. What was the topic of your dissertation?
Depends on whether you want the boring version or the more interesting version. It was the influence of Vikings on the pronouns in Middle English. So when you picture Vikings, you picture them with a helmet, you picture them rampaging around, killing everybody. They did a lot of that in England and in the north of England, but they also eventually settled down and started living there. And about a century after they settled down and started living there, people started writing English third-person plural pronouns the way that people from Norway and Sweden and Denmark used them. So we know that there was enough of an influence from the Vikings, the way that they spoke, so that gradually the English pronouns got replaced. The word they and the word their and the word them are all Scandinavian. They're not the Old English words. So if you go back and read Old English, you actually, from like the year 1000 or 1100, you have to actually learn different pronouns to understand when they're talking about they, their, them, is other words. Mm-hmm. So that's the specific topic, and I was looking at how gradually those words sort of showed up in different parts of England at different times. The part that I still really like to use now is that when groups of people move into a new place, they influence the way that the language is spoken, where they show up. So that's relevant to any part of the world.
What sparked your interest in
birth made me want to do
English
pronouns.
Why is that?
Right? I knew Norwegian, and I loved Norwegian. I loved the language, and I liked exploring the ways that people could influence each other's speech, groups of people. I liked what's called sociolinguistics, which is looking at the relationship between speech and society, how people's language reflects their affiliations and the experiences that they've had and what they want as well as where they've been. So I liked sociolinguistics, but I also really liked historical linguistics, going back and looking at the history of English. So I wanted to do something like this that would combine the insights of sociolinguistics, where you're looking at language and society, with the methodology of historical linguistics, where you're looking at texts instead of interviewing people and just looking at what the text. For one thing, you can sit down and interview a text for as long as you like. It doesn't talk back. You can go back and check what it said another time, and you can sort of keep getting information out of it.
Wow, that's really interesting.
That was mostly quantitative. If you're going to do qualitative research on that topic, it would be more like looking at how people felt about the influence on their language. There's not a lot. They weren't paying attention. Mm-hmm. They were just talking. You can do sort of qualitative work on dialects and the history of English, but it's by looking at very specific texts where people actually start to come out and say, hey, I don't like it that everybody's using all this French. I'm going to write something in English for a change. That kind of thing. So you get a few comments like that, but mostly it was quantitative. I was counting every time I went through a text that had any Middle English in it or Old English. I just counted pronouns. One challenge that actually would probably be useful for you to know about was that I had to learn I assumed going into it that I was going to be able to write a dissertation about the influence that Scandinavian people had on English without going very deeply into the history. I assumed that there would be books out there or articles that would just summarize the history of the Scandinavian contact with people in medieval England. There were a lot of articles, but there was no one article. and they did not agree with each other. So the way I put it is I had to give myself what amounted to a master's degree in history, in medieval English history. I had to find out who all the people were who were writing about what the Scandinavians had done in the British Isles in that time period, and how the language might have been influenced, and how the culture was influenced. I had to find out who all those people were, which ones were old, which ones were current, which ones were agreeing with each other, disagreeing with each other, which ones I thought were cuckoo once I had really looked carefully at what they were saying, and which ones I thought made sense. It took about 2 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so as I say, I started early and I finished late, and part of it was that I had to do that bootstrapping my way through it, because I didn't have anybody that I could ask. I wasn't at a school where there was anybody who specialized in that. So I couldn't just say, point me to 3 or 4 articles, not that there were 3 or 4. So what I did was I would start reading an article, and then I would look at the people that they cited, and I would see who came up that I had thought was interesting, and I would go and read that article, and I would see who they cited, and if you do that for a few weeks, then you start to notice that certain names keep coming up over and over and over again. So and then gradually, as you really look at and evaluate what they're saying, you start to figure out, okay, this is this group, they think one way. This is this other group, they're all being very polite, but they don't agree with each other. And here are some outliers, and these people are old-fashioned, and I don't have to know what this person says because everybody thinks they're completely out to lunch. So you sort of get a picture of the field, but it's a lot easier if you actually know somebody with a PhD in that field who can say to you, he's out to lunch, you don't have to listen to him.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tell us how your research has influenced your teaching, and in what ways have you been able to bring the insights of your research to your courses at an undergraduate level?
For the last 2 years, I've been teaching the honors first-year English sequence here, and for the second semester, we do a research paper. So one of the things I thought was very important was for the students to actually do some research, because you're doing research now, so I'm concluding that you're in a research methods class.
Yes,
maybe.
I am in a research methods
yeah.
class.
So, but one of the mistakes that people make is they assume that research means that you just go and read what's in the library, or you read what's on JSTOR, or whatever. There are 2 kinds of research. There's the one where you go find out what everybody else has said, and there's the one where you go and actually add to that literature by doing something new that nobody has actually done before. I wanted the students to have an experience of what that second kind was like, so that they would really understand the difference between them. So because I've done my own research, I'm able to take them through the steps of how to prepare it, what kinds of questions to ask, how to write it up. It doesn't always translate really well, because the kind of research that I'm having them do is interviews. It's more sort of social science-y, and I never really did a lot of interviews. I'm not the kind of, I haven't in the past. When I was in graduate school, I didn't do a lot of interviews. I did a few.
Okay. Also, Olivia said you were you had a couple publications that were out.
Right.
DIUs?
I don't suppose I could lay my hands on them at the moment. Well, let's see, there's one, actually, I wrote an article that came out just a year or 2 ago about teaching history of English at an HBCU.
Okay.
Because that's sort of like, when you think about literature, English literature, people talk about, well, it's all dead white men from England, and what's the relevance for modern Americans who might be African American. So one way to deal with that, of course, is to do the literature classes, do different literature classes, and there's one for all the dead white guys, and there's one for all the live black women, or whatever. But history of English has traditionally been very much of a sort of a dead white males kind of class. So teaching history of English in a way that makes it look at all relevant to African Americans at an HBCU can be a challenge. It's fun, actually, but it's not built into the way that the class has traditionally been taught.
Yeah.
So I wrote an article about that.
Okay.
A paper that came out in something called Studies in Medieval and Renaissance Teaching. SMART. Okay, it's one of those initialisms. I've had a short article published in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I've got a really thrilling piece on verb inflections in a Middle English poem in an anthology. When I say really thrilling, I'm being a little sarcastic. I like it. It's an interesting topic to me. But most people would like to just sort of lie down and die if they think about it. You know, they would rather not look at the way the verbs are being handled. There was a funny rule in probably the basic insights are that even in Middle English, people did not speak English all the same way. People in the North spoke it differently from people in the South. So that's step one. And they were really different. Like, they had completely different verbal paradigms. So we say now, well, there's one way to do English verbs, and it's that you have an S on the end of a present tense verb when it's got a third person singular subject, and that's your subject-verb agreement, and the rest of the time you don't have an S on it. But in Middle English and Old English, think of all that sort of, he leadeth me beside the still waters, for example, okay? That ETH ending, there were other endings in Middle English from the ones that we use now, and early modern English, which is actually what that is. So you had a set of endings on verbs in the north of England, and you had a different set of endings on verbs in the middle of England, and you had a different other set of endings in the south of England. It was actually the same endings, but they were used in different ways. So people from the north and people from the Midlands and people from the south undoubtedly thought that all of the others were weird because they were using the verbs wrong. The other piece of it is in the north there was a little extra tweak to it, which is that the rule for how you ended verbs in the north was different if the subject was a pronoun from if the subject was a noun. This is very un-English. Most dialects of English have never worried about whether the subject is a pronoun or a noun. It doesn't make any difference to what kind of ending the verb has got. But for a while in Middle English in the north, it did make a difference. So I was looking at how that plays out in one poem.
Wow, that's interesting.
Really detailed stuff.
Yes. Are you currently conducting any research?
Yes.
Can you...
Slang.
Slang?
College slang.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, in Olivia, do you want to show up for this part? It's a class called Research in College Slang. We had a class last year in sociolinguistics, and it was a fun course, and as we were talking about it, it became clear to me that it might be possible to actually have an entire class called Research in College Slang, and we would actually collect examples of the slang used on different campuses and start looking into the ways that they're different or similar. Because the basic question is slang, well, actually, to back up a little bit, people have different definitions of what slang means. To some people it just means, say, anything non-standard. To some people it means ebonics. To some people it means vocabulary words that show that you're a member of a particular group, but that you wouldn't use them during an interview. So, slang can be everything from, words for drugs, words for criminal activities, to words for food. The word kid, meaning a small child, was originally slang. It used to mean a baby goat. And then it was a slang word in the criminal underworld for a child that you might steal to get ransom. So, and now we all say kids, and it's with difficulty that you can keep it out of students' papers. They sort of forget that the word children exists. This one step is to find out what people on college campuses define slang as. And another step is to figure out what slang words they have, and whether the slang words on one campus are the same as the slang words on another campus, or whether they're different. And even if they're the same across different groups on the same campus. So we're doing some of that.
Okay. How important do you think it is for undergraduates to complete a course in research methods?
I never took one. It would probably have been good if I had. You might want me to say, you don't need that class. But I think it's actually a good idea, because as I teach juniors and seniors who are English majors, it's very helpful, or other majors for that matter. Sometimes there's somebody from history or something in one of my classes. It can be very helpful if they have actually learned a little bit about how to do research by the time they get to be juniors and seniors. I think it's a good idea.
You think it's a good idea?
Yeah, I do.
Do you have any encouraging words for those students?
Embroiled in the midst of their research methods class. that which does not kill me makes me stronger. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, we must do what we are afraid to do. So there we go. Those are the only 2 words of wisdom I've got for you.
Oh, snaps. Okay, well, thank you for your time.
Okay.
And it was a definitely interesting interview. Appreciate it.
Nice to meet you, Karen.
Nice to meet you as well. And that's a wrap.
When you're talking about research methods classes, we're back now to the question of, do you mean research in the sense of looking things up and finding out what other people have said, or research in the sense of doing your own research? Because there are those 2 kinds, right? Research where you're doing essentially a literature review, where you go and find out everything that has been said on this topic and evaluate it and weigh it and balance it, is one thing. And research where you actually try to add to the body of knowledge by doing your own investigation is another matter. That's the one that involves the IRB, that's where you do surveys, interviews. So there's a big difference between understanding what's out there already and contributing to it by doing some of your own. And that's a challenge, because as an undergraduate, how likely are you to come up with something that's brand new? It has to be well designed by somebody who actually knows where the gaps in the literature are, or else you have to not mind replicating something that isn't really new, coming up with something that has been done before, but just doing it on your own. Anybody really needs to be able to evaluate the literature that's out there on a given topic. You need to be able to understand the difference between, say, a popular magazine article about drug use amongst teenagers and the actual medical studies or behavioral studies that article might be based on. One of the reasons to be able to tell the difference between them is that the popular articles are very often wrong. They're very often sensationalist. They're very often one-sided, biased. Every time I read something in the news that is on something I have expert knowledge about, it's not fully accurate, and sometimes it's deeply misleading. So it's important to be able to go find and understand the original studies that give you the actual information people have come up with, and then to be able to look at them and compare them to each other and say, well, these aren't coming up with the same results. And then to be able to think about why they are not coming up with the same results, and which one might be wrong and which one might be right, or do they have 2 pieces of the truth. That, I think, is important no matter what subject you're doing. So that kind of research is going to be useful to you for the rest of your life, because it's a kind of critical thinking and ability to evaluate people's arguments and the quality of the work that they've been doing. And then going and doing your own research may or may not be everybody's cup of tea. But if you want to really get under the skin of how the research that you're reading was done, then doing your own projects is very helpful. See if that's any more use to you.
That explains a lot more. Thank you so much.
All right.
You're awesome.
Well, and I hope that and see, if you hadn't had a research methods class, you would never have come over here, and I wouldn't have gotten to meet you.